Faith is the bottom line. We have to have faith because human beings can't know everything. We can't figure this one out completely. But our faith, if it's informed by good theology, it can withstand an awful lot more of the storms and miseries of life than an untested, uninformed faith.
Welcome to Thinking About God with Dr. Barry Whitney. In this series, Dr. Whitney explores the formidable challenge of reconciling belief in God with the evil, injustice, and suffering in the world. What can be learned from theological study on this problem? What can be learned from faith? Separating good and bad answers by sound theological and biblical study and reflection has been central in Dr. Whitney's attempt to justify belief in God despite the world's evil and suffering.
There are two ways: theodicies, which are rational explanations, right, and anti-theodicies. There are two kinds of anti-theodicies. Some people say there is no decent, acceptable explanation for suffering. There's nothing we can understand about it. All we can do is to say, I'm going to protest, I'm going to say that God shouldn't have done it, and I might even become an atheist. Elie Wiesel comes pretty darn close over here. Elie Wiesel, in his reaction to the Holocaust, he said God was put on trial and found guilty, and God should have done better. And because God didn't do better, we'd better live without that kind of God. This kind of anti-theodicy says, what we're doing in this class is a waste of time, trying to understand answers. They're saying all we should do is protest and likely become cynical and become atheistic, or at least redefine God in a way that no one would even recognize. You know what Roth does in chapter 1? He says God can't be good if God had the power and didn't do it. And that's a radical reinterpretation of God, which just doesn't work for a Jew, Christian, and Muslim. If God's not good, you and I are in big trouble. Granted, after the Holocaust, there was this deadly silence among Jews and Christians. We didn't know what to say. Nobody started talking until the 1960s. We couldn't say anything. We were shocked and numbed by finding all these dead people, realizing that so many people have been killed. When you write books about this, like Roth does, and make that your specialty, Holocaust theology, you can get very emotional. And he's basically saying, every time you pray to God, remember that this God isn't good, and you have to keep whining and protesting and complaining about why he didn't do something, and maybe you can make him good. Like, it's insane, but this is one legitimate reaction, I guess. This is why, in bold relief, why people turn away from God. The greatest cause of atheism and skepticism is this supposedly unsolvable problem. We just are numb. The way we react to evil and suffering is usually emotional first. We have to get to the rational. We have to think about it, though, because emotions can go anywhere. Dostoevsky, he's just going to give you all these examples of children suffering, and he's going to say, if one child suffers, I can't believe in God. Now, Dostoevsky didn't lose his faith, but he certainly gave you in a novel, The Brothers Karamazov, one chapter of that novel called Rebellion Against God, Rebellion. He showed you how people can react. Children suffering, 5, 6, 7, 8 horrible examples of children suffering. You don't tell me that it was all part of God's plan. Don't tell me they're going to go to heaven when they die, because they still suffered and nothing can undo that suffering. These people, the ones in the protest, all sound pretty much the same. Every course that is on the problem of evil, you're going to see Dostoevsky, and you're going to see Elie Wiesel, you're going to see the Book of Job. These are the classics. What I'm trying to say here is that there are two kinds of reaction. If you're not willing to go through what we're going to do here and try to figure out what the greatest minds and what we think about them say about why we can believe in God, see if they've justified God against all this suffering, these are the only two options. You can either say, I don't know, I can't use my mind is useless in this, I'm just going to have faith. I'm just going to try to maintain my faith, and don't burden me with intellect. Believe me, a lot of people are there. Of course we can't understand why God would allow all this suffering. Most people, the majority, a huge majority, don't like theology. They don't understand that theology is trying to what it's trying to do. It's trying to organize what we should believe in faith, because if we didn't have theology, if we didn't have rational thinking about basic problems like this, we'd all have different emotional answers. We'd all have different interpretations, and some people would suffer because of their horrible answers. Theology is trying to make our life simpler by saying, here's what the greatest minds have said. It's been tested. We agree with them mostly. They have a few flaws. Let's deal with them. Most people are Faithists. They simply say, like Job, and there's nothing wrong with it with Job. He's a little more than a Faithist, but he suffers. His three friends give him theology, and Job, he not only protests to God, but he prays, and he finally gets an answer. It's the pinnacle of Faithism. Don't lose faith in God. Job never lost his faith. Now here's my little point though. Because his three friends delivered theology, you're being punished. The average person reads the book of Job or hears a sermon on it. They usually say, all you need is faith. Look at Job's friends. They were the intellects, and they gave him bad theology. Yes, they gave bad theology, but that doesn't mean that all theology is bad. It was just their theology that was bad. In this culture, for some reason, there are so many Faithists out there, anti-intellectual, anti-theology, anti-rationality, that books are being written now about where did the Christian mind go? One's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. Like, where is it? It's better to utilize the best theology because we have some decent answers to these things. David in the Psalms. I've got 3 Psalms, just in case I don't get to this again and you've got a whole 2 weeks and you're lost and wondering, why am I reading Psalm 22 and Psalm 88 and Psalm 130? They're just like the book of Job. David is suffering, and instead of losing his faith, he keeps saying, I'm in the mire, I'm suffering, I'm miserable, but I do remember how you saved us before. And then he goes back to his suffering and a few more verses of whining and protesting and complaining and appealing with God. Yeah, but you did save Moses and you did save Abraham. All of a sudden he realizes it's therapy. It's therapeutic. It's a spiritual therapy to remind yourself that when you're suffering, that God did save in the past, and the implication is God will save in the future. So do you know Psalm 22, Jesus' words on the cross, when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you deserted me? He was quoting Psalm 22 on the cross just as he died, and he knew, of course, that Psalm 22 ends up praising God. God doesn't abandon David in Psalm 22. It feels like that, but there's an optimistic end to it, just like in Job. So Psalm 22, Psalm 88, and Psalm 130 are kind of like mini books of Job. I'll try to show you Psalm 22, how the thing's set up. Whining, remembering how God saved. A little more whining, complaining, a little bit about God did save in the past. Much more whining, God saved in the past. All of a sudden, it kicked in. God saved in the past. Why am I whining? Of course he's going to save me in the future. That's why we keep the old stories alive. It gives us hope. Faith is the evidence of what God has done. It's not just some blind faith that if you walk into a pitch black night and somebody says there's a swimming pool there, jump into it and just have faith there's water. You know, it's October, so the chances are not good. But faith is evidence of what God has done. We're going to look, first of all, at anti-theodicies, because that's where I expect you are. That's where most people are. You haven't gone through all these sophisticated theological answers. You just basically say, either I don't like suffering, I can't believe in God, I think I'm going to protest, and I'm going to doubt God's existence. That's the protest one. Or you say, I believe in God, I have no problem, Job is my hero, he kept faith. Abraham Lincoln read Job every day. A lot of people like Job. It's comforting in a way. The whole book is filled with bad theology, unfortunately. I've got a little chapter that you can read on the faith solution, this one, God and Evil, chapter 3. I want to show you what's wrong with simply just having faith without explanation. If you don't have a theological attitude toward this, to look at the best theological answers, faith just amounts to, I just believe in God. And you usually feed yourself, it must be God's doing for a good reason. God must have done it for a good reason. That's what most people say. I think it's saying that God did it. And I don't think that that's what faith is. We should have a reasoned faith, a reasonable faith. Outside this one class, all my other classes try to justify what we believe. There's a class called Justifying Religious Beliefs. Instead of just believing, you have to give evidence and rationality and arguments for what you believe. Faith alone is not some merit badge to walk through life saying, I'm a complete theological illiterate, but I have faith. Well, good for you. You have faith in what, though? That God's punishing you? That it's somehow God's plan that you suffer? That kind of faith is untested. It's shallow. It's what everybody thinks is important, but God wants reasonable faith. Faith that's been tested, matured. A faith that you've lived and you're starting to see why you have faith instead of just saying, I have faith, and you don't know why. Because quite frankly, that kind of faith cracks when suffering happens. So first of all, we're going to look at, here's the suffering, and Roth and Dostoevsky and Wiesel are going to say, we should really be doubting whether there's a God, or we should be changing our mind about what God is, because this doesn't seem right, and there's no explanation. These anti-theodicies are basically anti-theology, anti-intellectual. They don't want answers because they think all the answers fail. That's a bad attitude, I think. That's a very bad attitude. Walk into a science room and say, I don't want to do science, I want to do anti-science. I just want to sit here and say, I think the earth is flat, I think the sun is just about 36 feet away. Don't burden me with arguments. Just leave me to my ignorance, because I have faith in this and it feels good. I think we can grow spiritually if we actually do get away from this. I'm not saying that Faithism is bad. I think Faithism needs to turn into a reasonable, tested, mature Faithism. And you do that by looking at what these people say, and you get rid of some pretty bad answers, and you consider the issues and the options and alternatives, and all of a sudden, your faith is stronger. It's like listening to Beethoven, right? Or reading a poem. You can read it, you have an emotional reaction to it, and that's all there is to it. You go and study the stuff in English literature and in music class, and you get the depth. Like Bach wrote this thing backwards and forwards, and Mozart wrote this thing as a parody of this. Like when you know a little more than just the emotional feeling, when you have the intellectual underpinning of it all, it actually makes more sense. Now it's a mature emotional feeling you have, an informed emotional feeling. It doesn't destroy your emotional feeling. The Romantic poets would say, we murder the thing to dissect it. I'm not dissecting it, though. Apologies to Wordsworth. But what we're doing is we're understanding it more deeply. Faith is the bottom line. We have to have faith because human beings can't know everything. We can't figure this one out completely. But our faith, if it's informed by good theology, it can withstand an awful lot more of the storms and miseries of life than an untested, uninformed faith. So we're going to go through this ritual. Job is inspiring. It's a good text. But I can find theology in Job. It's not just Faithism. There's some pretty good theology when God speaks in that book. And in David, too. He's basically giving us what God has done. Like, that's not just pure faith. It's relying on the evidence of what God has done. We could stop there. We could easily stop there. I can see the temptation. Ignore all this as just human vanity, human pride, thinking we can solve this. And there is a movement called Anti-theodicy that Roth is leading with some others, saying that people like me are evil because it's called The Evil of Theodicy, one book. That's one of my favorites. The Evil of Theodicy. I've spent 40 years, grad school, all that stuff, my dissertation, 620 page, solving the problem of evil, all of this stuff. The evil of theodicy, the evil of thinking about this thing rationally. Their line is that you can't understand it, give it up. Go to physics class and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't understand this. Don't burden me. Just let me enjoy my naivety. Come on. I've got to make a case for theology. I've got some arguments, but if we don't think, I'm not sure our faith is very mature. I know I'm going against the grain. I know theology is not fun, but actually it is when you start reading these people. I'm going to give you tons of examples of what a faithist is. You could say Faithism is a protest, but it's usually a passive acceptance. The favorite one of mine is this professor who works in the deserts of Yemen. for 35 years, translating some godforsaken text into English, brings it back to his office in Washington, D.C., and sets the office on fire by mistake. He loses 35 years of work, and what is his reaction? A passive faithism. It was God's will. I don't know why, but I believe in God, and I just have to accept that. I think we can do better. And that's not what Job did. Putting Job there is almost a crime, because the Bible goes beyond that. Job and the Psalms are not just blind faithists. We've misunderstood them, is going to be my argument. They have evidence for their faith. They've thought about it. This stuff isn't a waste of time. This kind of just gives you the problems, lets you see how people solve. Is free will worth it? Should God have made us with less freedom? Should God intervene more with miracles? Should everybody be saved in the end? Because, what about children suffering? All these questions have to be addressed. Is there gratuitous evil, meaningless evil? Does all evil lead to a good end? Once we have some working answers to those things, I think you can have some pretty strong faith. And I think people who are skeptical about God can see that we're not... that's half the reason, too. Those of us who believe in God don't want to just walk in and say, hey, I believe in God, but it's just my personal faith. What good is that? I have to say why. I have to justify my belief. I have to make an argument. If you believe anything, I don't care whether it's atheism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, you have to justify what you believe. What's the evidence? What gives you reason? You can't just say, I believe it because I've always believed it. That's just socialization. Most students say, I believe it because it feels good. It gives me a sense of identity. It makes my life feel like I'm somebody. It gives me a purpose. Yeah, that's true, but is it true? I want to know whether it's true or not. How can you tell me whether this thing that gives your life purpose and meaning is true? That's called justifying our beliefs. We have to do that now, those of us who are religious, because there's atheism and skepticism in this culture and at this university all around us. And if we're going to hold religious beliefs, we better have some reasons. We can't just say, it's because it makes me feel good. It's because I've always believed. Because I believe the Bible or the Quran is true. Well, why is it true? What's your evidence that it's true? We can do that. We actually have the ability to justify what we believe and test it against differing beliefs. It's amazing. We don't do it enough, but I certainly do. All my courses do that except this one. And actually, this one is doing that. Now that I think about it, I was thinking this was the one exception, but it's justifying belief in God, that God is just despite the fact of suffering.
Please join us for more episodes of Dr. Whitney's God and Evil series and other series that will be available on this channel. Dr. Whitney is an acknowledged international authority on the problem of evil, for which he has published dozens of important works. These include his book, Theodicy, The Problem of God and Evil, the only definitive annotated bibliography on the problem of evil, as well as his popular book, What Are They Saying About God and Evil, and dozens of other books, book chapters, journal articles, and book reviews. He has also published articles in the New Catholic Encyclopedia and in the forthcoming New Westminster Dictionary of Christian Theology. For more information and resources, please visit Dr. Whitney's website at drbarrywhitney.com and his Facebook page, Thinking About God with Dr. Barry Whitney. The God and Evil series was recorded in Dr. Whitney's university course on God and Evil. The lectures have been edited for a wider audience and enhanced by music composed by Dr. Whitney specifically for this series. This God and Evil series is the property of Dr. Whitney, 2016.